Hey everyone, Jake Lloyd-Bacon here.
Along with Paul Bianchi.
And Alexandra Hoy.
Hey, we all host different shows on Dragon Wagon Radio.
We do, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Not at all. We are here to talk about Dungeons and Dragon Wagon,
a narrative podcast series in which we venture into a mythical land for a D&D inspired role-playing game.
Alexandra and I are joined by Matt Hinksman and a very special guest of quest for each chapter of an epic saga in which we must take on the roles of half-orcs, dark elves, and more as we fight our way through a fantastical land of peril, drama, and often hilarity.
All of which is controlled by me, the Dungeon Master, and the players' chance rolls of the die.
And our show is for everyone. Even if you know nothing about D&D or role-playing games, we've got you covered.
That's right. Our game sessions are highly edited, easy to follow, sound designed from top to bottom, and completely immersive.
Yeah, our episodes sound more like a well-produced radio drama than an RPG show.
So what are you waiting for? Join the adventure on Dungeons and Dragon Wagon at dndwpod.com or wherever you find great podcasts.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Fellow Quillers, I am so excited about today's episode. We welcome back Dorothea Dickerman. She's been with us before for a couple of episodes, and if you haven't found them, you should go look them up. She was a guest for The Italian Job and for an episode that we called For the Love of Shakespeare, which has been very popular with a lot of you. And it's one of the reasons why I have requested that she come back today for this episode to discuss the 3,649 lines of poetry that exist in Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, and why they are worth our interest as Quillers, and why they are so important to the Shakespeare authorship controversy. Dorothea today will use her background as a lawyer, as many of you Quillers know, to delve into some of the Tudor law, politics, and first and third party historical documents that exist around these two poems and the players involved, which we will discuss right now. Here we go. Let's ask some questions. Dorothea, I have questions. Can you answer them?
Stephen, I never know whether I can answer your questions or not, but I will do my best.
Well, welcome back. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm so glad that this is our topic today. So many of our listeners have written to me and have asked about the types of topics that we're going to discuss today, and I think that what you're about to bring to the table is something that has long needed to be discussed and has been a swirling whirlwind of interest for Oxfordians, skeptics, post-Stratfordians of all ilks and all kinds. And I think what you're about to share is going to blow open the doors on some topics that everybody wants to know about. So let's get started.
Okay. Well, I think
you first mentioned, I believe, in the episode of For the Love of Shakespeare, we very lightly touched on this and the importance of these poems, and that you were going to be doing further research into them. And that's what led to this episode coming. So sort of set the stage, as you were, if you will, for the listeners today, why we're going here and what we're about to go into.
Well, I'd be happy to do that. These poems are long and they are intimidating, even for people who love the plays and the sonnets. I started thinking about them as a pair and realized that they are inseparable and that they have to be read together and that the stories within them are related. I knew pretty much who Venus was and who Adonis were and what the result of their coming together was. But I think a lot of people have wondered, why the Rape of Lucrece? It is quite a painful tale. Venus and Adonis is very funny and very sexy. But Lucrece is disturbing. And all of a sudden it came to me that where these poems had come into the canon was as the first works of William Shakespeare in 1593 and 94, at which time Anne Cecil was dead, Leicester was dead, Oxford had remarried to Elizabeth Trentham and had fathered the Earl son that he had always sought. And he took on Burleigh for some untruths that Burleigh had been perpetrating for years. And the visual image for me was the pair of Titian's paintings, Venus and Adonis, which I just went to Boston to see, by the way, and at the Isabel Gardner Museum. It's a spectacular exhibit. And his Lucrezia and Tarquinius. So I put those two pieces together. Stephen and I briefly covered it on our last episode, and I told him I would look into it more, and here we are.
Okay, so just because I want to make sure that I'm not befuddled, because you just threw so many things at me that may, and some of them may have just gone right over my head. But just to backtrack and explain a little bit, when you talk about Titian, the artist, the famous Italian artist, and you talk about his two paintings, you're talking about the painting of Venus and Adonis, the painting of Lucrezia and Tarquinius, which is the Rape of Lucrece.
That's correct.
And those paintings only existed in one location in the world for hundreds of years, and that's in Italy.
Yep, that's right. And we talked about that. I talked about that last time. So
and one of the things that we talk about a lot when we talk about that artist and those paintings is how brilliantly described those paintings are in both of those poems. And many authorship doubters or skeptics or whatever we want to call it, let's just say many Quillers believe that the only way you could have written those poems about those paintings is if you had stood before those paintings in real life and seen them yourself, and maybe even taken notes, like you were standing at a museum, sitting at a chair, looking at a painting for an hour and writing stuff down. And that's something that the man from Stratford absolutely never could have done.
Well, certainly for Willis Stratford to have written the poems, his initial hurdles that you would have to get over. You have to explain how an unknown 30-year-old poet, fresh from the countryside, would dedicate to a 19-year-old earl his first works. And these topics, I think, sound embarrassing and horrifying if you're 19. So even before you get to the concept of the paintings, let's just talk about the concept of the poems. Some people
when you say, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but when you say you went and saw them in Boston, are they on tour? Or are they part of some collection?
The Isabel Gardner Museum has 7 paintings by Titian that are currently on exhibit. They're called his Poesia. They were mostly done for Philip II of Spain over time, and they are a series of myths, Roman and Greek myths, many of them from Ovid's Metamorphoses, of which Titian has about 30 Venus and Adonises, and not all of them are his. Some of them come from his studio and his students. But yeah, there are a bunch of them. The Tarquin is not there, but there are a bunch of them that are in the Isabel Stewart Garden Museum right now. And for those of you in Boston, you may want to go take a look at them.
That's fantastic. Oh, I wish and I don't know how many of our listeners are aware of that, but that's fantastic. And that just opens more doors to the authorship question for us as we look at these great works from this, great Renaissance artist that obviously inspired these works that have the Shakespeare name on them. And most importantly, the first 2 works to ever have the Shakespeare name upon them.
That's right. So let's talk about the works.
Yes.
Some people take the concept of love in Lucretia's dedication to be romantic love. And they think there was an affair or a sexual attraction between the bard, whether he was Willis Stratford or Oxford, and the young earl. So the message maybe was love men and not women. But the obstacle to that interpretation is that Tudor law regarded gay love as a felony, punishable by an awful death. And these two poems, unlike the sonnets, are dedicated to a specifically named individual. So publishing to declare that you were in love with or having a gay love affair with the Earl of Southampton by name certainly would have brought the law down on the poet, and perhaps even on the Earl, in 1593 to 1594. Tudor law on this point is shocking and brutal to us today, and we're going to talk about some other egregious Tudor laws, but it's also a historical fact, and I'm going to use it that way. Okay. So we have a purpose that the bard must have had that is different than just telling a superficial storyline. And we have a relationship with Southampton that must be different than romantic love or just poet and patron. And when you look at these...
your argument is you have this poet, whoever he is, who decides that he's going to sign his works by the name of William Shakespeare. And these very first two, his debut albums, as it were, his two debut albums are both dedicated to the Earl of Southampton, out of the blue. And they both involve descriptions of events from Ovid's Metamorphoses, these myths. And they're both very salacious, and they're both full of sexual charged energy. And they're both tragic, because even Venus and Adonis does get killed by the boar, right?
He does.
It is a tragic poem. They're extremely long. They're smash hits when they hit the scene, and
they absolutely
go through multiple printings.
They do go through 16 editions for Venus and Adonis, and they go through 8 for Lucrece. They are read by men and women. They are elegantly and expensively bound. They have almost identical cover page ornaments. And they are, as you say, breakout bestsellers because, sex, violence, and humor probably fanned their sales as much then as now. Bonner Cuddick, in one of the previous episodes, pointed out that the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, personally approved and issued the license for Venus and Adonis. We're going to talk about that poem, and I think Tudor and modern readers cannot fail to see Elizabeth as a lusty of Venus, using every wile that woman ever devised to seduce the mystery man, who is Adonis. And Bonner pointed out that Whitgift was the publication industry's ultimate censor. He could review and either license or obliterate written works, and yet he approved this one.
And so your argument to begin with is the dedications of these poems to Southampton, if they were designed for this poet to declare his male-to-male love for the Earl of Southampton as a homosexual love affair, would have been planting a death sentence on the Earl of Southampton.
Well, I don't, let's put it this way. It certainly would have put a death sentence on the poet. I mean, you can skirt the law, but when you poke it or slap it in the face, it's likely to come down on you. Whether or not an earl in 1593 would have been, beheaded because some poet accused him of being involved in a homosexual love affair, I can't really say, but it's not where you want to come out with your first.
Well, and we know that other poets,
Marlowe
particularly, Marlowe was accused of this. Marlowe stood before the Privy Council accused of sodomy and had to defend himself. Oxford himself was accused of this and had to defend himself. So what you're talking about is a real thing. Like, this was a way that people tried to wipe out their enemies, was accused them of being sodomites, accused them of these, quote unquote, at the time, heinous crimes. And it worked often.
Right. And we don't think that way today, but it's a historical, and right, really, it's a historical fact. So shall we start with some history? go on with a little law?
Let's go.
Take a look at Venus and Adonis?
I just wanted to clarify that because I was a little confused by
all
those details that you threw out, and I want our listeners to be...
Yeah, we had talked about that last time, so I didn't want to talk about it again. I wanted to really get into deeper and not repeat, where we had been before. So if we can start, we're good to go.
Let's go.
Okay, we're going to start with 2 deaths. In June 1588, Oxford is off fighting the Spanish Armada, and Anne Cecil dies. His wife dies of a fever in Greenwich Palace, and she's universally mourned. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, also died that year in September, and fewer people mourned his passing, except for the Queen. She was inconsolable at his loss. She called him her eyes, and she loved him better than anyone in her entire life. So, William Cecil, after his daughter's death at 31, shocking and in grief, in early 1589, he begins this elaborate tomb for Anne in Westminster Abbey. And our listeners might want to pull up on the internet some photos of that tomb because it kind of becomes a character in our story here. He also took her 3 daughters to live with him and their grandmother, Mildred, in Burleigh House on the Strand. Elizabeth de Vere, who was known in the family as Bess, and we're going to call her Bess, was 14, and Bridget was 5, and Susan was 2.
That's de Vere.
That's de Vere. And in a mean-spirited moment, Burleigh sues Oxford for their dowries, and Oxford won't pay. We know, and we discussed before, Oxford had lived at Burleigh House. He was the first royal ward. And in December 1571, we talked about it last time, he had married Anne against his will. Their December wedding had been a second attempt because he didn't show at the one in September. So things get worse because Mildred passes away in April. And so Anne's tomb becomes this double tomb and really a monument to the Cecil family. And that's why I say, if you've got ability to go online and look at it, go look at it. It's not just Anne and Mildred in effigy. It's William, it's Robert, it's the 3 daughters. It's in the chapel next to where Queen Elizabeth is buried. It is a huge monument. Henry Rosalie, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, who's the dedicatee of the 2 poems, had been born the year before Bess, and he was Burleigh's last royal ward. He came to Burleigh House in December 1581, just as Bess and Anne were leaving it, due to the death of Thomas Rosalie, the 2nd Earl, in October. So the young Earl, who went by Harry, and we're going to call him that, spent the next years at St. John's College, Cambridge, and then at Gray's Inn, sorry to hear that, Stephen. And in July of 1589, Bess left her younger sisters and she went off to be a maid of honor with the Queen. So Bess and Harry did not live at Burleigh House at the same time, but Burleigh controlled them both physically and he controlled their marriages. And like he did with his daughter and Oxford, when Oxford was his ward, Burleigh began spinning betrothal plans for Harry and Bess, because he wanted to elevate another member of his immediate family into the nobility. And it became
He was a regular Dolly Levi, this guy, William Burleigh. Matchmaker.
Oh, yeah. Hey, I got these, right?
Goodness.
I got these 2 kids. Let's put them together. And by the way, my daughter became the Countess of Oxford. I can do even better for my granddaughter. So we need to mention for our listeners, and I know you would correct me if I didn't do it, that by 1589, the succession had become the burning national issue. Everybody was talking about it. The Queen was 56 that year, and there was a tremendous amount of concern about who was going to succeed her on the throne.
Wait a minute. You're telling me that there were people in the world in the late 1580s, early 1590s, who were concerned about who the next king or queen would be? Nobody cares about that. Like right now, nobody cares about that Queen Elizabeth II is on her last years, and nobody cares about who might the new king be.
Yeah, but the Queen was a lot more powerful in 1589 than the first Elizabeth was more powerful than the second Elizabeth.
Wait a minute, you can't go. You can't go to a local grocery store without seeing something about those people on the covers of magazines today, right now, in a time when it's not as important, when she doesn't have as much power. But we're still obsessed with the succession of the throne of England. And
we are.
Hasn't changed in centuries and centuries. And so at this time that you're talking about, the 1580s, 1590s, it had to be the national obsession.
It was. And what's interesting, I got to sprinkle in a little law. I know people are going to go, oh God, not law. But yeah, just a little. In 1571, the English law changed as to who is or ought to be the right heir and successor to the Queen. It had permitted only heirs of the body, which is her legitimate children. But it was changed in 1571 to permit the natural issue of Her Majesty's body, which allowed her bastard or natural children, as they were called, just in case. So this guy, William Warner, in 1606, published a history of England called Albion's England. And in it, he explained how since Edward II, heirs apparent have been known as princes of Wales, till our queen deceased concealed her heir. Now, this is 1606, after Elizabeth is dead, but here's a contemporaneous source saying that Elizabeth had left a hidden male heir somewhere. So just hang on to that. We'll feed it into the story. Okay. So in October 1589, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, made a decision on this thorny problem that he'd been kicking around, which is he had to minimize not one scandal, but two scandals in making the match between Bess and Harry that he so very much desired. And it is how Burleigh resolved those scandals that ultimately led to the publication of Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. His first problem was how to formalize the necessary legal records about the lineage of a 15-year-old boy who had none. According to his biographer, Charlotte Stopes, Harry had no official date of birth, no baptism date, and no godparents. This was very odd for the firstborn son.
That is very odd. And what
very
year
odd.
What year do we believe he was born?
Well, we're going to talk about that, Stephen. We're going to talk about.
I'm going to guess it was somewhere around 1571 when they changed the law.
No, you're too early. You're too early. I think that might have been for one of
That's curious, isn't it, that they would change the law? And
but remember, Stephen, there are many, many rumors that Elizabeth and Dudley had a son and a daughter together. Indeed, Arthur, we think, was born in 1561. And he ended up in the court, and Leicester reportedly acknowledged him. And Arthur ended up in the court of Spain, and he disappeared. So my guess is that 1571 date was changed with Leicester's encouragement to deal with Arthur. There is also a rumor.
I just think that law change is super curious.
No, it is curious, but I don't think it was for the child we're going to talk about. I think it was for Arthur. There was also rumor that the Duke of Hereford was trying to get his son engaged to Elizabeth's daughter, who was kept hidden, it was said. And then this wonderful line is, but there were bishops who would swear that she was legitimate. So there is enough fomentation in the record to believe that there were children that Leicester had with Elizabeth. Anyway, getting back to Harry.
Yes.
Harry's biographer is Charlotte Stopes. And she's the one that, says there's no contemporaneous records. And this is, it's very odd. It's particularly odd because Thomas Rosalie, the second Earl, and we're going to call him Thomas, just to keep from having to spin out that moniker so much. He had a king and queen as his godparents. So Harry really had a shadowy beginning for who he was. Burleigh had been acquiring control over Harry's personal information for years. He just needed to make it all consistent. And what was that information out there on Harry? Well, there was a letter dated October 6, 1573, that Thomas wrote to his jailer, Sir William Moore, announcing that Mary, the Countess of Southampton, his wife, we will call her Mary, had that day delivered a goodly boy. Now, that October 6th letter is dated a mere 5 months after Thomas had been released from the Tower for treason, and Mary had been allowed to visit him for the first time in 18 months. Clearly, with a little math, anyone can conclude that goodly boy could not be Thomas's son. More interesting is that William Moore worked for Burleigh and the Privy Council, and so he knew firsthand that Thomas had been in prison in the Tower for a year before and 4 months after the necessary conception date, without conjugal visits, obviously. So William Moore and Burleigh both knew this child wasn't Thomas's son. So we have to ask, what earl willingly and joyfully announces that his wife has delivered a bastard son to inherit his earldom, when a little math shows that the child isn't his, and he writes it to his jailer, who knew exactly where he was? What's the answer? An earl who has just been released from prison and never wants to go back because he had multiple treason charges against his name, right? So, I don't know, Stephen.
I'll do whatever you say. Just don't put me back in that tower.
Don't put me back. Yeah, so maybe Mary was pregnant by another man. Maybe she never had a goodly boy. But it's not hard to conclude that Thomas's letter was written in exchange for his freedom, and it might have been backdated. What else is there out there on Harry? Well, there's a matriculation record at St. John's College that says Harry was 12 years old by December 15, 1585, but it gives no birthday. Of course, Burleigh was the source of that information because he personally placed Harry in St. John's. So Burleigh had to confirm this record on Harry in his own hand for a change, instead of someone else's at his instruction, because of the betrothal. So he chose his diary, and on October 6, 1589, he writes something in his diary. But what Burleigh wrote was not Harry's birth date. What he wrote in Latin was the age, not only of Harry, but of 2 other wards as of October 6th, 1589. And this is what he wrote. I'm translating from the Latin. Henry, Earl of Southampton, was aged 16 years. Edward, Earl of Bedford, was aged 15 years. Roger, Earl of Rutland, was aged 15 years. So Burleigh was not indicating that all 3 boys shared the same birthday of October 6th in different years. He's saying how old they were as of October 6th. What's really interesting is that Burleigh reversed the ages of Harry and Bedford. Edward Russell, the 3rd Earl of Bedford, was born on December 20th, 1572, and he actually was 16 years old by October 6th, 1589. Harry was actually the younger and only 15 years old by the date. Whether Harry's birth date is October 6, 1573, or about 9 months later, as I'm going to propose. Really interesting. Burleigh was clever, and he could manipulate.
People lie about the ages of children all the time to get them enrolled into different schools or to get them onto certain rides at amusement parks or whatever the reason is.
A little more serious.
Like parents lie about their kids' ages all the time, and for all intents and purposes, Burleigh is the parental guardian of Harry at that time. And there could be reasons for him to want to claim the boy is older than he really is.
Yes, there are reasons. I think he purposely reversed the ages of the 2 boys so that he could correct his mistake later. And he chose the 6th to align it with the letter that Thomas had been coerced to joyfully write to his jailer. Stopes didn't pick up on that reversal of ages of Bedford and Southampton Harry. And she also incorrectly concluded that Burleigh said Harry and Rutland, but not Bedford, were born on the same day in different years. So she took Burleigh's identical language, each boy was aged so many years, and she interpreted it differently for the 3 boys. But any lawyer will tell you identical language requires identical meaning. So why all this mystery and all these intentional misrepresentations about Harry's birth date, his age, and his parentage? We have to ask, what was Burleigh hiding? And what had he done? Aha. So here we go. Let's talk about what Burleigh knew, pretended not to know, and needed to control. Starting in early 1573, there is a lot of well-documented third-party contemporary correspondence, and you can follow the actions of the interested parties in the court daybook that show there was a love affair between Queen Elizabeth and Oxford. And Hank Winnemore, Bill Boyle, Catherine Shulgin, and others have spoken and written volumes about it, and I'm not going to go except for the most pertinent details, okay? So,
Okay.
at the time...
And just so listeners know, you can find episodes featuring all three of those people that Dorothea just named. In fact, you could almost call that the Don't Quill the Messenger Greatest Hits Volume 1 right there.
Okay. At the time Thomas was seeing his wife for the first time in 18 months, 17-year-old Anne Cecil was complaining to her father about the Queen's attentions to her husband. Now, Anne was a teenager, and there's very little she could do to compete with the 40-year-old, as you've often said, Stephen, most powerful woman in England. And there wasn't anything Burleigh was prepared to do about it either. We talked last time about my favorite court tattletale, Gilbert Talbot, who confirmed the affair and Cecil's reaction to it in a May 1573 letter to his father, the Earl of Shrewsbury. This is where he says Oxford had great credit and that the Queen delighteth more in his person and his dancing and his valiantness than any other. It's a famous quote. Gilbert also goes on to say that Mildred Cecil had unwisely declared herself jealous, which had come to the Queen's ear, and that Burleigh winketh at all these love matters, but will not meddle in any way. So Burleigh knew, and he wanted to just forget he knew, but instead he decided to employ Bernard Dewhurst to spy on Oxford and report back on his comings and goings with the Queen. So, at the same time, Douglas Sheffield later gave this date for her marriage to Leicester, by whom she had a child. So while the Queen was busy with Oxford, it seems like her longtime lover Leicester took up with Douglas. And, you know, nothing like taking on a new lover to make a former one jealous. And Douglas is female, by the way. It's a double S at the end. I know we think of it as a male name these days, but no, Douglas Sheffield is female. So through 73 and 74, the Queen makes these series of visits to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker. And that may be why Archbishop John Whitgraff, 20 years later, cleared the publication of Venus and Adonis, because maybe he knew something about Elizabeth and Oxford's relationship as successor to Parker. I don't really know any more than that, but there seems to be some connection there. So, in January, Mary de Vere, Oxford's sister, was sworn in, and that's the way they talked about it, sworn into the sisterhood as a lady of the Privy Chamber. So, if the Queen were pregnant and wanted to keep her condition secret, Mary was absolutely assured to be silent about it, yes?
Okay.
Yeah, court records reveal who was sleeping where at the Archbishop's Lambeth house. In April, Anne complained about her inferior rooms because she was housed separately from Oxford. Oxford, by the way, had relocated his London digs to the master's suite at the Savoy, directly across the street from her parents' Burleigh house. And somebody was clearly giving the Lord Chamberlain, who was responsible for room assignments, it was the Earl of Sussex, very precise directions about who was sleeping where on every stop on the progress. Interestingly, Anne's rooms really were badly located. Christopher Hatton was sleeping in Oxford's former rooms, but there's no mention made of where Oxford was sleeping, and perhaps that's because no one thought it was prudent to inquire. So, someone out there in our listeners is going to say, okay, Dorothea, how did Queen Elizabeth hide a pregnancy and deliver a baby without that becoming public knowledge?
Especially if everyone knows where everyone is sleeping and it's all been so meticulously documented.
Okay, well, you know, Anne Vavasour, Oxford's lover at a later date and a maid of honor, kept her pregnancy secret from the Queen so successfully that the Queen never found out about it until after she delivered at court. But Queen Elizabeth had a huge advantage here, which is she dictated fashion. And about the time in early 1584 that she would have needed to disguise her expanding tummy, fashions got puffier, and sleeves got bombasted and enormous, and waists got shorter, and skirts got rounder, and they got more pleated in the front. And she also wore these huge robes for ceremonies that covered everything. She kept her distance from people. She substituted some of her women who could dress up and pass for her on occasion. And at the end of the pregnancy, she disappeared from public view for months, okay? Beginning in February, Queen Elizabeth started avoiding people and erratically changing her travel plans. She danced around visits proposed by the French Duc d'Alençon. She wanted to meet him in private. She said, "We have said we could in no case to an open and public interview." Then she changed her mind and wouldn't meet at all. Then she said she'd meet him in any port, but only, Stephen, I love this, to gaze from afar, and only before the 20th of May. And then she refused to give him permission to set foot in England. So she obviously didn't want to see him, and something important was happening at the end of May. Apart from going to church
so some would argue, well, she was just being coy. She was just
some
being
might.
coy and flirtatious because she was considering him as a marriage partner.
Yeah, she didn't want him to see her. So apart from one church service in Greenwich and 2 audiences, she remained secluded with a small group of attendants for all of March, April, May, and June. And she only emerged again in July to the public eye. So beginning in May, she became even more reclusive and erratic. Talbot reports in early May that she was going to go to Havering at Bower and remain there until her progress to Bristol in July. But in late May, he noted there was a change in plans due to the unseasonableness of the year. And I'm going to add, that or being heavily pregnant. In mid-May, she sends a groom to head off the French embassy.
That would be unseasonable. That's very
It would be unseasonable.
For the Queen, that's very unseasonable.
She sent a groom in mid-May to head off Ambassador de la Mothe, and she put him off again in June, saying she was just in tears over Charles IX's death. She left Havering at Bower very suddenly on June 13th for Greenwich, and she ordered her baggage train to make this big circle and go back again. On June 22nd, the Flanders commissioner begged for an audience, but was put off several times by Sussex, saying she was indisposed. The commissioner said he would wait. Sussex said it would be 3 to 4 days. The commissioner said, "Well, I have this letter. Would you give it to her?" Sussex said, "Well, she's in bed, weakened by medicine." And Sussex finally promised a reply the next morning, but he left court really early and he never returned one. Talbot wrote on June 28th, "The Queen stirreth little. She had been excessively melancholy. She was troubled with weighty causes." And he adds that Oxford had an unknown cause before her, which she did not answer as favorably as he had expected, it seems. Burleigh at the same date happened to write Sussex saying Anne would do her duties for the Queen, but Oxford was keeping away. So on June 30th, Elizabeth gives these confused orders to Burleigh and Ralph Sadler, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, not to join her on progress, but tarry in London. And Burleigh is surprised, and he goes, "Why?" And the explanation he gets is that she is apprehensive of some danger in her absence, which might lead her melancholy, and therefore thought it advisable that he stay in London. In other words, no reason at all. And she spent that night on a 2,000-acre grounds of the old Merton Priory, which had a huge abbey, as well as a bunch of outbuildings and a library, but all of those buildings had been dismantled to build none such palace by her father. And why she went there and with whom is unknown. So very, very mysterious. However you put it together, she's avoiding being seen. There's a pattern here for a substantial period of time in the spring and early summer of 74. She makes a sudden flight back to London in mid-June, and then she goes completely underground for 2 weeks. And she emerges tearful and temperamental. She and Oxford have a massive row behind closed doors just before she comes out in July and goes on progress, and that's when he leaves London without permission and heads for Calais. So to me, all of her behavior is consistent with the late stages of pregnancy, delivery, and postpartum depression and mood swings. Anne is being purposely kept from court, and this fight that the Oxford and the Queen had must have been over something or someone that meant a lot to
Give me
them.
that boy, and I
Yeah.
will go with thee.
Yep.
Not
Yeah,
for
yeah.
thy fairy kingdom.
It's probably that fight, Stephen. Yes, it probably is. So, let's look at Burleigh, because he is such an interesting guy. He was aware of the birth of Oxford's son sometime in late June of 1574, and he was probably the most likely person to have been trusted with placing the child in a foster home. There was a need for secrecy. I mean, we talked about what happened to Arthur. He ends up, missing. So Burleigh also had another reason in 1589 for trying. So anyway, I think Burleigh put the kid with the Southamptons, and basically he could control them, because Thomas had been in prison and written this letter, and so he pretty much had locked that part down. But then Thomas died. He got the child, who is, now Harry and the Queen's royal ward, but he gets him back into Burleigh House. So he had another problem, Burleigh did. He had boxed himself in with another lie. His problem was that while this match between Harry and Bess would give him really close and familiar access to an heir, potential heir to the throne, the match might appear to be void and illegal due to consanguinity if the pair were considered to be half-siblings through a common father, and that common father would be Oxford. Their children would be bastards by law. There'd be all these rumors. Burleigh's political life was rocked by the rumors about Anne, which we'll get to in a minute, according to his biographer, Stephen Alford. So Burleigh was most concerned with his political clout and the legacy of the Cecil family. So he already had sort of tamped down the information on Harry's origin, but the problem was there were these incredible rumors that had circulated since 1576 and for years thereafter that Anne had borne Oxford a child that wasn't his. So that child,
and those rumors perpetuated by some, like the Iagos of the world. Yes,
indeed.
In Oxford's life. But then by Oxford himself, right? Like he spent the first 5 years of Bess's life disavowing that little girl. And it's not until
we will talk about why.
Not until she's 5 years old does he finally say, okay, yes, that's my daughter, and I will have a part in her.
Yeah, but we're going to talk about why he makes that decision. Right?
Yes.
There's a reason why he changed. So, all right. So, Burleigh knows the kids are both bastards. And if you think about Lear, remember those musings on bastards in Lear? Why does it make a difference? This is a big issue, right? Burleigh knew they weren't related by blood. If they had been, he would have not betrothed them. But he has two things. He is a self-made politician and he is a father. And so in 1589, he chose to save the reputation of his own child, Anne. He had lied about her for years, and it would conveniently quiet the political waters for himself. And so, in addition to the misinformation about Harry's age, he wrote on Anne's monument in Westminster Abbey, I told you to get back to this monument, in brass letters, that she had been a faithful wife without fault for her husband. And what's really odd, Stephen, is that is true. And we'll see why. Mm-hmm. So, Oxford had taken Anne and Bess, this is the point you just raised, into his house and agreed to raise Bess after this blow to his honor from the scandal that had made Anne the fable of the world in December of 1581. 10 years of estrangement and separation, and he changes his mind. Why does he change his mind? Because at exactly the same time, December 1581, Harry became a royal ward at Burleigh House. Oxford wanted access to his 7-year-old son, which is a point you've already raised. Burleigh wanted his daughter's shame ended and his 6-year-old granddaughter freed from being labeled the bastard child of an unnamed father, and it was a fair trade. And so if Oxford took in Bess, he could have access to Harry. They got over their differences for a while. This is a power struggle between Burleigh and Oxford.
Parenthood is an incredible motivator. It is probably the greatest motivator in the world. And parents want people who have the natural touch, which is also a quote that's from Macbeth, actually. People who have the natural touch, and they want to love their children, and they want to be a part of the lives of their children. And so it makes total sense what you're saying, that would be the proclivity of Oxford and why he would do certain things in order to have that opportunity.
Yep. So in 1589, Burleigh clears up the messy record one way in order to continue appearances that Bess was Oxford's daughter by Anne, which she wasn't, and Harry was not Oxford's son by the Queen, which she was.
Right.
But the problem is that Burleigh didn't preserve Harry's right to succeed his mother. And a further complication to that was that Harry didn't see things Burleigh's way. Harry, remember, for 5 years, until November 1594, after both poems were published, he resisted the proposed marriage to Bess. And since there were no parish records, no baptism records, and no godparents to attest to his date of birth, he took the position he was of legal age in November of 1594, and he officially ended the marriage. In addition, Oxford didn't see things Burleigh's way. And one thing we know about the Earl is that he was stubborn on telling the truth, and he was especially stubborn about what was his own, and that was his life. He wanted history about himself and his family to go down true. So he took a huge risk, political risk, in 93 and again in 94. He exposed Burleigh's lies. He told the truth about Bess and Harry's conceptions because he published, under a gossamer modesty veil, these two stories, the ones he knew his audience really wanted, the stories everybody at court had whispered about and gossiped about for decades. He took what was uniquely known and belonged to him, his life, which was his seduction by the Queen and Anne's rape, and he spun them into bestsellers. And if our audience wants to read about Harry's rights, his conception and parentage, it's explained in Venus and Adonis, Bess's in the Rape of Lucrece.
Wow, that's explosive, Dorothea.
Yeah.
That is explosive.
But
and let's delve deeper into that. I'm completely with you right now. You've got me. And
okay, thank you.
I am all the way with you right now. You've got me. I want to know more. That makes more sense than I think anything I have ever heard that explains why these two poems exist, why they're the first two works to have the name William Shakespeare upon them.
They are. That's really important. That's really important, Stephen, because it is Oxford making a break and creating a new synonym, and he is punning on the power of his pen to defeat Burleigh's political
People
lies.
talk about the sonnets forever and a day. People talk about the plays and go through them and over them and pore over them and the things that are incorrect and the things that are correct. And this is why it's this writer and this is why it's this writer. Let's go to the beginning. Begin at the Beguine, and let's start with the first two works. And wow.
Let's go. Yeah, let's go. They are actually revealing like the two great bedroom secrets of Tudor England are in these poems. And as you said, they are the ones that the first two poems, and they're the only works by William Shakespeare in Burleigh's lifetime. So let's go right into Venus and Adonis.
Let's do that.
Let's do it. So,
by the way, Venus and Adonis makes a magnificent dramatic presentation with three actors.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I have done it. I've done it where you have one actor who is Venus, one actor who is Adonis, and one actor who is the narrator, and you can divide the lines up in that way, and you can deliver that as a dramatic presentation in front of an audience, and they eat it like candy 400 years later, like they did when it was first printed.
Yep. Well, for listeners who aren't, into these myths, really quickly, Ovid's classical version, and it is in the Metamorphoses, which are this anthology of verses about Roman and Greek myths where humans are transformed into trees and rivers and stars and flowers. And in Oxford's version, there is a passionate older goddess who seduces a young man who's barely out of his boyhood. She spins him elaborate stories. They sit very cozily together while she tries to persuade him to stay away from hunting dangerous animals. But, young men being what they are, he doesn't listen. He's gored by the boar while he's hunting, and he dies. She arrives at his side too late, and she changes his blood into a pomegranate flower. And that's the classical story. But the bard tells a significantly different story with that as the underpinning. First of all, his Venus. Ovid calls her Dame Venus or goddess, but he never calls her queen. But the bard's Venus is a lovesick queen, a fair queen, the queen of love. Her eyes are two leaders to their queen, but all in vain, good queen, it will not be. She even commands Adonis, be ruled by me. And in the final lines of the poem, where the queen means to immure herself and not be seen. Those are the final lines. And that is exactly what Elizabeth did during the last months of her pregnancy.
Well, that's a very vague metaphor, I think. Referring.
You think?
That's so vague, that metaphor of comparing Venus
you don't like that one,
to a
huh?
queen.
Yeah. Well, the bard even goes further and tells us exactly which queen. His queen tells Adonis the story, how the stern and direful god of war had been her captive before Adonis, had hung his lance over her altar, had learned to dance for her, made his tent her bed, and she had led him her prisoner in a red rose chain. Okay, with those jaw-dropping details, can you miss the reference to Elizabeth's love affair with Leicester? No, right?
No, too subtle.
She points out...
Too vague. Sorry, I can't follow you.
Okay,
Leicester,
sorry. All right, let me go
Mars,
on. Let me go on. Yeah, let me go on. She points out her physical assets to Adonis, and the bard's queen says Adonis's rejection of her would be understandable were I foul, wrinkled, old, ill-natured, rheumatic, thick-sighted, or barren. And of course, the joke that no one in 1593 would miss is that over the previous 20 years, Elizabeth had become all of those things. She was a beauty before, but not in 1593.
No way.
She goes on to say, didst thou not mark my face? Which is, obviously a reference to the smallpox marks on Elizabeth's skin. So you have to ask if Will Stratford could bring the physical faults and follies of his vain and aging monarch to everyone's attention, and if he would be foolish enough, even as a new poet from the provinces, to publish this type of thing in London under his own name. So the bard's Venus curses love. She can't be happy in it. No one can. Elizabeth famously was spiteful and vengeful if people fell in love or became betrothed without her permission, and sent them, including Oxford, to prison for it. The bard plays really merrily and naughtily on the Ovid's description of the terrain, the ground upon which Venus and Adonis walk. And he alludes to Elizabeth's love of hunting deer in parks. She says, I'll be a park, and thou shalt be my deer. Feed where thou wilt, on mountain or dale. Whew. Well, okay. If you're not rummaging to find your copy right now, I don't know what we can do for you.
I gotta turn the air on. I'm getting a little sweaty under the collar.
Yes, it certainly is the heat up.
Would you read that line again? Whoo, yum! Wow, feed where thou will. Right. I would love a queen to say
nice
that to
stuff,
me.
huh?
Yeah.
So, who's the mystery man Adonis? Ovid says he has a fair and brave countenance. And the bard throws in lots of additional details. He calls him the field's chief flower, which is, of course, a reference to success in the lists, and sets up the image of young men as flowers, which is repeated throughout the poem, even to the boy who's born at the end. And it characterizes Adonis as somebody who, like Oxford, had a lot of success in arms. The bard's Adonis is described as a tender boy. He has a beardless face, which is like Ovid's. Except for the bard's Adonis has these killer dimples when he smiles, and his emotions show transparently on his own face. He's also sexually inexperienced. As the Queen Venus pursues him, he turns his head away. He blushes and pales. He complains that his fair alabaster skin is burning in the noontime sun. He burns with bashful shame, and his cheeks have a maiden blush. She says that he is unripe, but may yet be tasted. And since Oxford had been avoiding Anne since they were married, it's quite possible that the 40-year-old queen was his first lover. He says, "Before I know myself, seek not to know me." Venus tries to bribe him. She says, "One sweet kiss shall pay this countless debt." And of course, due to the crushing fees of the ward system that allowed the queen to financially abuse Oxford's estates during his wardship, he owed Elizabeth a staggering amount of money by the time he finally reached his majority. And he didn't get that inheritance at 21. He got it at 23, which was just the age Oxford was in 1573, when it looks like this seduction probably took place. The bard's Adonis, like Oxford, is stubborn, obdurate, Venus says, forced to content but never obey. He knows Venus very well. He treats her in ways no ordinary young man would dare treat a queen or a goddess. He acts sometimes more like a petulant son. He breathes angrily in her face, comic. In fact, he is close to tears. He lectures her on her lust. He refuses to be kissed. He closes his eyes so he won't have to see her up close. And then he stares her down in a war of looks. And he says no about a dozen times. You pointed out, Elizabeth was his foster parent in a sort of a legal sense. So, how do we get to seduction, consummation, conception, and fatherhood? Ovid maintains a really PG rating. Venus clings to Adonis, follows him, puts her head in his lap, tells him stories about Atalanta and the golden apple, but never obtains more. The steaminess factor, if we discussed, is higher in the Bard's version. Venus grapples him, she pulls him off his horse, she kisses and fondles and nuzzles and rubs against him. She hints at and commands copulation. She talks about seeds springing from seeds and beauty from beauty. Thou wast begot, to get it is thy duty. By the law of nature, thou art bound to breed. And the Bard uses all of these same analogies in the first 17 sonnets when trying to persuade his son, the one that's conceived here, that it's his duty to marry and beget a child. She continues the flower imagery, and when we get to Adonis's performance, predictably, and it's at lines 555 to 570 if anyone wants to make a note.
And I was about to say, I encourage you, Quillers, right now, hit pause, go grab your copy of Venus and Adonis, open it up in front of you while you continue to listen to this episode, or hit rewind and start over with it in front of you, because you had no idea that the Bard's first work was a piece of soft porn. But P.S. it is, and here it is.
We're a family show, so we're not going to reveal it, but let me just say the queen is unsatisfied and she wants him to try again. And these, I love it. No, there's no go on this, right? And the words, they're so pithy, they're so witty. Good queen, it will not be, the Bard writes. So, as far as conception of a child from this act, the first line of a poem introduces the royal color purple, and that color will also close the poem.
Yes, it does.
So, Ovid says Venus uses her goddess powers to transform Adonis's blood into that red pomegranate flower. But the Bard's Venus has no such powers because she is mortal. Adonis was melted like a vapor from her sight once he had impregnated her, as if he doesn't exist. And that's exactly how Elizabeth treated Oxford when she ended that affair in late June 1574. The words are, "In his blood that lay on the ground spilled, a purple flower sprang up, checkered and white, resembling well his pale cheeks, and the blood which round drops upon their whiteness stood."
Which is...
Venus bows her head.
That is mirrored as well in Oberon's words in A Midsummer Night's Dream when he says to Puck, "Seek that flower, once white, now turned purple, where the bolt of Cupid fell to the ground after missing that votress of that certain order, right, which is the queen, right? So here's Oberon in A Midsummer Night's Dream saying Cupid shot at the queen and it missed, and where it hit the ground, that flower that was white is now purple. That's the flower that has the magic that I need to make these lovers see love in their eyes. And so you can connect that play and this poem together very easily through those lines.
Yeah, you can. Anyway, she bows her head to the flower and she says it smells like her Adonis. So the newborn resembles his father with his pale skin flushed with red. And she picks up the flower and she cradles it like a baby, promising to care for it. And when she breaks the stem, that is, I think what that means is cuts the umbilical cord, it oozes green sap. And vert or vert in French is green. And so these references to green are really, really important. And she says at that moment, this color, the green color, was thy father's guise, sweet issue of a more sweet-smelling sire. Here was thy father's bed, here in my breast, thou art the next of blood, and 'tis thy right. So, that was what everyone wanted to know. The details of the seduction of the 17th Earl of Oxford by Queen Elizabeth, the resulting birth of the son, who by right, under the change in the succession law of 1571, was next of blood to the English throne. And when the bard dedicated it to his son, he wanted to set in motion that world's hopeful expectation that Elizabeth would fulfill those vows that she had made 20 years before. And those vows, of course, are in the last several lines of Venus and Adonis.
And doesn't that, in my mind right now, what you just said, explains the very name William Shakespeare. It explains why that name comes on the scene, where it comes from, how it comes, and that Edward de Vere creates that name as a clever Mark Twain type of name to publish this piece of work, to set that record straight, to try to put into motion what he hopes will be his son eventually becoming the King of England.
Yeah, and I think really, you know, when you think about Lucrece's dedication, it opens with the words, "The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end. What I have done is yours. What I have to do is yours. Being part in all I have, devoutedly yours." And I hope, you know, with your explanation and my explanation, Stephen, that our listeners are hearing those words now as being written from a father to his son. Because the love is not eros, it's not romantic love, it's storge, it's paternal love. And as you said, if you are a parent, you understand why we love our children without end and why everything we've done and everything we have to do is theirs. And for those who aren't parents, I hope someone's loved you that way, because it's really powerful love.
Those who are not parents have parents, and they know that their parents
That's right.
love them that way. And
that way,
I'm going to take a guess that the great majority of the listeners, fellow Quillers, ask yourself, at your day job, at your desk job, whatever that happens to be in life, do you have photographs? Excuse me. Do you have photographs of your children? I do. I keep photographs of my children at my desk, at my regular day job, because sometimes during the day, I need to turn and look at those photos and say, this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm going to swallow that from my boss. This is why I'm going to get over this frustration. This is why I'm going to punch this clock. This is why I cannot leave here till 5 o'clock. I'm doing this for them, because what I do and what I am is all theirs.
Well, I think that's a very common human, it's one of the things that makes us human. So, right?
Yes.
Oxford gave Harry these poems and immortality. And other fathers might have given horses or armor. But, this is why I said that Oxford makes his political position very clear in these poems. And also the entire canon. He taught his son how to be a virtuous, wise, and courageous king, just as much as he was encouraging Elizabeth to avoid the anarchy of an unresolved succession. But we should turn to Rape of Lucrece.
Let's go. They're connected.
Let's go.
Let's go there. So I'm with you. I've been with you the whole way. Fellow Quillers, I hope you're with us, because here we go. strap on your seatbelts.
We're going.
And by the way, Dorothea,
We're going,
I know I'm going to get so many emails about this episode, and I'm thrilled to have them all. I want to hear from you, fellow Quillers. I want you to write to me and tell me you're with us, you're against us, you think it's wonderful, you think it's hogwash. I want to know. I want to know how you feel about this conversation. This is a conversation that's been needing to be had, and here it is, and I can't wait for the feedback on all ends of the spectrum, because I'm certain there are also some of you out there going, oh yeah, and the earth is flat too, you people are crazy. Well, you give me a better explanation, because this one seems to fit perfectly in my mind. So let's go on to the next poem and add some extra weight to your argument, counselor.
All righty. Well, the counselor is going to start with a little more egregious Tudor law, because she promised, right? Yes. So, in Tudor England, a noblewoman's job was to marry chaste and produce legitimate children, particularly a son or an heir. And if there was a whiff of sexual experience prior to the marriage or infidelity, that was shame to the woman and humiliation to her husband. He could never hold his head up again. Now, a bastard in the bloodline is a dishonor that no man could be expected to tolerate.
Thank you, Edmund.
So, at English law, at the time, there was an exception for an exculpation, which means forgiveness, of a female who was raped. However, conception implied her consent by law. I'm going to say this 3 different ways, because to the modern mind, this is barbaric. The first is Henry Finch, who wrote in 1627 2-set books called Law or a Discourse Thereof, explains this law very clearly. He wrote, rape is the carnal abusing of a woman against her will. But if the woman conceive upon any carnal abusing of her, that is no rape, for she cannot conceive unless she consent.
Oh my God!
I'm sure there's some jaws.
There are lawmakers today.
A jaw drop?
There are lawmakers in the modern America who believe that. That's been a that's been a recent thing that people. If a baby is conceived, it's not rape.
Okay. Well, okay. So this is where things stood in Tudor England. Is that right? Rape is, the victim is presumed innocent unless she conceived, because somehow the law did not see that conception could occur biologically.
That is insanity.
So without consent, it is insanity. As I said, law can make you crazy. But this is one of the reasons abortive medicines were well known and eagerly sought. So let's go back to the history.
You wear your rue with a difference.
We pause with Anne being kept from court and Oxford and Elizabeth having this raging argument. And she leaves Bristol and he leaves for Calais. And we know he's gone most of July 1574. He's returned when he's fetched, but not to Anne. He goes to the Queen in progress at Bristol. He's forgiven, restored to favor, and progress continues to Bath. And Hank Whittemore, more than anyone, has written and spoken so eloquently on the sonnets, particularly sonnets 153 and 154, and the bards being at Bath as a bad distempered guest who found no cure there. So it always sounded to me like Oxford was still in love with the Queen, but she was clearly finished with him. So early October 1574, at Hampton Court, Oxford makes a mistake in anger that he regretted for the rest of his life. Openly in the presence chamber, he announced that if Anne were pregnant, it was not by him. Now, maybe there was some insult he was retorting to, but blurting out those words cost him a lot because someone heard it who wanted to get even with him. And maybe that was Leicester, who was rising again in the Queen's favor because he had recently abandoned Douglas, Sheffield, and their secret son, who had been born in August. And maybe Leicester thought deflowering Oxford's wife was fair game after Oxford had had an affair and son with the Queen. And maybe it was someone else, like one of his Catholic Howard relatives. But the facts indicate that Anne was still likely a virgin 3 years after her wedding to Oxford, and that she was impregnated by a rapist in early October 1574 at Hampton Court. And I can't help it. One line from Hamlet, you probably know which one it is. Conception is a blessing, but not as your daughter may conceive. Friend, look to it.
Look to it, friend. Look to it.
Yep. So, by early December, Oxford was preparing to
fishmonger.
travel to
I know you well. You are a fishmonger.
There we go. Oxford's going to France and later to Italy, and Anne is vomiting a lot. So at some point, he either deduced or she confessed that she was pregnant. And remember, her job was to produce a male heir and be faithful. So the effect of her news and this looming dishonor right before he left must have sent Oxford reeling, and he either had to throw her aside for adultery or he had to help her end the pregnancy. And that he chose the latter. And how do we know? Dorothea, how do you know?
How do you know this, Dorothea?
So we're going to start with, how do you know this, Dorothea? We're going to start with letters of 2 third-party witnesses. We discussed the first one last time, but I don't think we discussed the second. So the first letter, December 7th, Anne is about 2 months pregnant. And it's Sir Thomas Smith, Oxford's old tutor, Cecil's old family friend. He writes a sheepish letter to an enraged and incredulous Mildred Cecil, explaining why he had given Oxford a distillation for Anne that contained 2 abortives. Now, Mildred at this point believed the father was Oxford. Anne had been pathetically asking Sussex for better rooms, the willingler, I hope my husband will come thither to me. And Smith wrote Mildred, Madam, I sent yesterday of my water to my lord for my lady Oxford. Now, if Smith had meant that the my lord was any lord other than Oxford, he would have specified a different name, but he didn't. So Smith sent the distillation to Oxford for Anne. And that is the first of 4 indications that Oxford knew Anne was pregnant before he left for France, which is really important. Smith says, I think there might be some doubt about it because Mildred had sent him a howler of a letter. Smith backpedals. He then says he was sworn to secrecy. And then he says, but I would be as sorry that my lady of Oxford should miscarry as if she were 5 times my daughter. So Smith is saying he would be sorry if his distillation caused Anne to miscarry her child. And there is the confirmation that Anne is pregnant and not just ill with the flu or something. So Smith tries to soothe Mildred, and then he goes, well, if you just give a spoonful, if life were in the body, for it should disperse straight and comfort immediately the vital spirits. Anne's not dead, so the only life in the body and vital spirits could mean that she's pregnant, right? If she were happily pregnant, Stephen, she would have told her mother the good news and not taken an abortive.
Right. Absolutely.
If Oxford were the father, he would not have helped her abort a child who could be the next Earl of Oxford.
No, absolutely not.
But he prepares his travels, he writes his will, he leaves Anne nothing above her statutory 1/3 dower, he leaves nothing for the child she's carrying, and instead, he names his sister Mary as his heir. And then he leaves in the first week of February and sails for Calais. So, March 7th, 1589, Anne is now 5 months pregnant. Oxford is in Paris. And we have a letter from our second eyewitness, Dr. Richard Masters, who wrote to Burleigh reporting how, at Burleigh's request, Masters had dropped Anne's news on the Queen. Apparently, the excuse Burleigh told him to give the Queen for not telling her early worked really well. Masters writes, because your lordship did fear the concealing of it any longer, doubting lest the matter might otherwise come to the court, your lordship thought it a good and a piece of duty to have it imparted unto her majesty rather by yourself than by any other. And I pause here and I go, but Burleigh didn't impart the iffy news himself. He sent Masters. Why the double talk?
Because
why, if Anne's pregnancy...
he was afraid that she would kill
he
the
was
messenger.
Afraid. She would. She was touchy. I think she might judge Oxford had been unfaithful to her by sleeping with his wife.
Yep.
So he sent in this doctor. Why did he conceal it, right? Because everyone knew Oxford and Anne's marriage was unconsummated. So the Queen springs up in surprise and says I protest to God that next to him, that them that have interest in it, there's no one that can be more joyous than I. So then the Masters does something that astonishes me. He shows the Queen Anne's calculations of her missed menstrual cycles, and he reveals that Anne had asked him for a second abortive but he had counseled her to stay a while. Why was a married woman's personal menstrual calendar the Queen's business? And why would Masters show it to her? I think the only answer can be that paternity is the issue, and revealing that Oxford had lied in his outburst, or at least calling to question what he said. It was now very obvious that Anne was pregnant. But Dr. Masters also, maybe unwittingly, had just informed the Queen that Anne didn't want to be pregnant. And that should have raised suspicions about adultery or rape.
It's
So
also
Masters
possible
goes on
that
to
the
say that-
Queen already knew who the rapist was.
She might. Well, all right. This is going to be kind of a whodunit for our
Sure.
listeners. So,
Well,
so
we all
stay
love a mystery.
tuned.
That's
Stay
why we're
tuned.
here, right? We're all here because we love
All
this
right.
mystery and we want to try to solve it.
Right? So Masters also tells us that Anne was really distraught about her pregnancy in mid-February, as is after Oxford had left. Her face was fallen and thin. There was little color. When they tried to comfort her, she would cry, "Alas, alas, how should I rejoice, seeing he that should rejoice with me is not here? And to say the truth, I stand in doubt whether he pass on me and it or not." So what's Anne saying? She's saying that Oxford should rejoice if there were a reason he should not. And she doubted whether he'd pass in the present test on her, but not whether he will pass once he hears the news in the future test. So what we know is that Anne was uncertain whether Oxford in Paris currently believed her that she had been raped, right? She had told him he was raped. He left for Paris. She's been worried and worried and worried, trying to end the pregnancy, taking abortives. She's worried he doesn't believe her. He won't, how will he pass on it in her? But you know what the most interesting thing is? Her father hasn't written Oxford yet confirmation that she is pregnant. And so that's the second indication that Oxford knew before he left for Paris.
Yeah, Burleigh's not going to write a letter saying, by the way, your wife is pregnant, if Oxford already knows that. And he certainly would have written a letter, by the way, your wife is pregnant, if he were a proud grandfather to be and wanting his son-in-law.
Right, he's holding the info back.
That's a big disconnect. That's a giant disconnect.
He's holding the back, and he has Masters tell the Queen at about the same time he finally confirms it. Now, he had written doubtfully of it to Oxford before, but the actual confirmation hadn't left. So what does the Queen do? You gotta love this, Stephen. You're gonna love this. She calls Leicester from the next room, and she tells him everything. So gotta imagine Leicester listening to this, right? And
while Masters is there, while Masters is
Masters is there, they're meeting privately.
So here's Masters holding up calendars and charts that indicate when
exactly
Cecil has had her
last period. Exactly.
And the Queen immediately calls in Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and says, "Hey, you need to come see this." Yes, she does. You need to come see. It's an incredible scene,
you need
to
right?
Come see Anne Cecil de Vere's menstrual charts.
Okay, hang on to that. It comes back, right? Hang on to that. So anyway, Masters writes Burleigh that she was with great offense with my Lord Oxford. So Burleigh must have been really pleased to have hoodwinked the Queen, because he just made Oxford look like a liar who had left his tearful pregnant wife, right? He lied in court. He left his wife. She's pregnant. Certainly, Your Majesty will call him back, right? But Oxford doesn't fall for it. And we start with one of the most interesting cat and mouse correspondences in history, and a battle for control between the son-in-law and the father-in-law. And here we go. In March, when he responds to Burleigh, after Burleigh finally confirms Anne's pregnancy, Oxford sets a great trap for Burleigh. He writes, "For now that hath pleased God to give me a son of my own, as I hope it is, methink I have a better occasion to travel, sith I leave behind me one to supply my duty and service, either to my prince or my country." So I see 3 levels of meaning. Knowing Oxford, I'm probably missing more, but these are Dorothea's meanings. Yeah. First, there's a very innocuous level, which is like every other father. He wants a boy, right? You could read it that way. But then he says, a son of my own, as I hope it is. And that would indicate to Burleigh that Oxford knew, whether a boy or a girl, that Anne's child was a bastard. And that's the third indication that Oxford knew about Anne being pregnant by someone else before he left for Paris. Thirdly, God had already given Oxford a son, and that son was Harry. And when Oxford reminded Burleigh that Oxford had already served his prince by impregnating her, and that Oxford had left Harry behind to serve his country as heir to the throne. He never revealed explicitly what he knew, but he subtly threatened Burleigh, if you cross me, I will reveal to the world that Anne is pregnant by another, and the queen bore me a son. And so Oxford guaranteed that Burleigh would continue to sell his lands as Oxford instructed and to send travel expenses, although Burleigh grumbled about it a lot. Oxford wanted to stay away from Anne, hoping she would either miscarry or confess on her own, and then he could divorce her quietly, but he wanted to choose when.
He's
So
also
for
having
all
a
of those
great
people-
time.
And he's having a good time.
Magnificent time. And he's the dandy
why would
of
he walk
the
out?
continent, right? Like he's just having a blast as well.
He's learning and seeing a lot. Anyway, for all those people who have accused Oxford of being impulsive and hot-headed, I would challenge you to create a more perfect response. Burleigh's biographer, Stephen Alford, calls Burleigh the most powerful and capable politician of the Tudor century. You know, that means more than Cromwell. That means, of all the Tudor monarchs, he is the best politician. And these stakes are really high. And let's look at it this way. Oxford's 25 years old and Burleigh is 55 years old. It is a very gutsy move. Now, if Oxford thought he were the father, he might have come home, and he would not have written such a cool reply. If he knew he couldn't be the father, but was hearing it for the first time, he would have been on fire, furious, and yet he's not. His control and his coolness in that response, to me, is the fourth indication he already knew Anne was pregnant with a bastard before he left. So, the next letter is in September from Venice, and he asks Burleigh and Leicester, which is an interesting choice, to get him royal permission to travel more. And in the end, he throws in a thanks for news of Anne's delivery, and he sent Anne a gift from Venice, which is a little New Testament on which he wrote on the flyleaf in Latin that only true things last. He tells her to focus on the truth, always love the truth, and ask the author of the truth to nourish her. And those are his wishes, for her to be called true. And we might ask, what truth is that? Pretty obvious, huh?
Yeah.
So, and we know the story. Yeah, big. We'll see that again. Hang on to it. So anyway, in April 76, he's back in Paris and just about to come back to England. And we know he learns that his cousin, Henry Howard, has spread rumors that Oxford did not father Bess. Leicester's Commonwealth, which was anonymously published in 1584, claims that Leicester started those rumors due to an old grudge he bore Burleigh. And since Oxford was silent about Anne's plight for 16 months, he said nothing to protect her reputation, and certainly Burleigh had covered the truth. It's possible Leicester was speaking from very personal knowledge. And there were also rumors that Burleigh was trying to sabotage Oxford's finances.
Well, let's face it. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, is not a good character in any story
really
ever.
not.
He was a villain.
No.
He was an absolute villain. And the fact that the Queen loved him so much is actually tells us a lot about her as well, because the greatest love of her life was an absolute villain. And it's most likely was the cause of death for several people, including at least one of his own wives.
Yeah, he was known, and a lot of this comes from Leicester's Commonwealth, but also from other commentary. He was known for seducing women, including other people's wives, and he was really linked to a lot of deaths that looked like poisoning.
Yes.
Not to mention his wife, Amy Rosebart, his first wife.
He's potentially a Tudor serial killer.
You know what? That's what Leicester's Commonwealth says.
Yeah.
No wonder they wanted to suppress it. Okay, so There was a letter, of course, that Oxford writes when he returns to England after his capture by Stephen.
Pirates.
Yes.
Pirates.
He had forborne what should be private to myself, and he said he wouldn't be seen with Anne publicly. The self-control he exhibited over this emotional and dishonorable situation was doing, this is his private information that has gotten publicized. He has a right to be furious, but he is never rash, as he has been characterized. He wrote, he hoped there might have been, through private conference before, not needed to be the fable of the world if you, Burleigh, would have had the patience to understand me. So we can contemplate whether Anne knew her rapist. Maybe she saw him at court after the fact. But it is worth noting that no one, not even her powerful father, backed by his allies at court, his spies and his assassins, and he had them, dared to pursue her rapist or to raise it with the Queen. So whoever he was, he could intimidate the Lord High Treasurer. And make no mistake, but Lucrece is also a revenge poem. All right? So let's go bring Lucrece to life. Its classical sources are not the Metamorphoses, but Ovid's Fasti, which is
it's such a beautiful piece
right.
too. It's and again, folks, hit pause, go grab your Rape of Lucrece. If you haven't read it recently, read it and then hit play again and listen in. But it's such a beautiful piece, and it will make you cry. You will weep at her plight by the end of that poem.
Yeah, it is. It's very sad. Anyway, there's also a lot of Livy's history of Rome, and I'm just going to call them classical sources. So there's a lot been written about hundreds of lines in Lucrece, hundreds, maybe over 1,000 lines in Lucrece that appear nowhere else. They aren't in these classical sources, and the Bard's version is, again, like Venus and Adonis, very different than the classical sources. The Bard writes this prose synopsis that agrees with the classical sources. I'm just going to go through it quickly so you get the lay of the land if you don't know the story. Mm-hmm. So Collatine and other Roman officers are in camp. They're bragging about their wives and who's got the most virtuous wife. They decide to go, see who wins the bet. So they travel from camp back to their homes, and they surprise their wives, whatever their wives are doing. And Lucrece is deemed to be the most virtuous. Collatine wins the bet. When Tarquin sees Lucrece in Collatine's house, he desires her. The Roman officers return to camp, but Tarquin sneaks back alone and rapes Lucrece. The Bard's poem does not start there. It starts with lust-breathed Tarquin already in the saddle riding to Lucrece. So the wager, the investigatory trip, and Collatine's, victory winning the bet are completely omitted from the Bard's version. So who's Collatine? Let's try to figure it out. Since neither Ovid nor Livy blame Collatine for having bragged about Lucrece or having invited Tarquin into their home, in the classical sources, it is seeing Lucrece that sets off Tarquin's lust for her. Ovid goes on and on about her face, her form, her skin, her hair, her voice, and Livy says Tarquin was inflamed by her physical beauty. But the Bard dashes over Collatine, wave after wave of blame for his wife's rape. He says Collatine unwisely revealed what was private between him and Lucrece, and that is what makes Tarquin desire her, just as Oxford unwisely publicly said that Anne would not be pregnant by him, thus trumpeting that Anne was still a virgin. Mm-hmm. So the Bard stresses Collatine's blame for this publication of his private information. His Collatine, why did he unlock the treasure of his happy state? What priceless wealth the heavens had lent him? Oh, true happiness enjoyed by a few. Why is Collatine the publisher of that rich jewel he should have kept unknown? So if you have ever said something you later come to really regret because of its consequences, you will recognize this was not criticism of another person. This is self-castigation. This text is Oxford's mea culpa.
There's so much of the canon. So much of the canon is mea culpa. And in the relationships between fathers and daughters, you see the mea culpa of how he treated Bess in her early years, and then the reunion of father and daughter, even though he knows she is not his blood daughter.
He treats that way.
The constant throughout the canon of the plays of redemption of Anne, whether it's in Winter's Tale or which is a great one, or Hero in Much Ado About It. Like, there's just so many times that is a recurring theme in the canon of, oh my God, this was one of the worst mistakes I ever made in my whole life, and I need to set it right.
I mean, I think that absolutely. So the Bard's Tarquin gains Lucrece's confidence by telling her about her husband's fame, won in the fields of fruitful Italy, and talks about his high name made glorious by his chivalry. And of course, by 1594, Oxford had won fame in Italy and in the lists, and earned himself a high name by birth as well as acts. The Bard does a lot of lecturing on morality and honor and justice, and at points he addresses things personally to Harry, using Harry's own motto, that one for all or all for one we gauge, is life for honor in fell battles rage. For princes are the glass, the school, the book, where subjects' eyes do read, do look. So, at least this is dad giving lecture to son. Really interesting is the classical Collatine reacts to the rape the way we think a husband should, which is he asks what's wrong, and with her father, he comforts her and forgives her and mourns her suicide and raises the death cry. But the Bard's Collatine is so shocked when he learns of the rape that he is speechless for 110 lines. His breathing becomes so labored that he hyperventilates, and while other men there pledge revenge, it is not until she is dead that Collatine can speak. It is not until her father begins to wail that Collatine, like Oxford, starts as if from a dream. And the Bard explains Collatine's silence by saying it was a deep vexation of his inward soul, having served a dumb arrest on his tongue, who mad that sorrow should use his control, or keeping from heartbreaking words so long. He begins to talk, but his lips can't churn out the words, and sometimes he just says Tarquin through his teeth, as if the name he tore. So this is Oxford explaining why he could not and did not speak about Anne's rape until after her death, and Burleigh's monument in Westminster Abbey goes up, praising her and damning him as an uncaring husband. And now he writes Lucrece. Mm-hmm. So, who's Lucrece? The Bard's Lucrece is a fair, word repeated. I hear fair, there. Tarquin knows she's a virgin, which the classical Lucrece is not. He says he must deflower. He talks about her never conquered fort. Mm-hmm. And pure chastity is rifled from her store. Mm-hmm. So the Bard describes Lucrece sleeping as if she lay in effigy on her tomb. And this is where you need to look at the tomb. Her head lying on a pillow like Anne's effigy does in Westminster Abbey, between whose hills her head entombed is, where, like a virtuous monument, she lies, to be admired by lewd, unhallowed eyes. Those lewd, unhallowed eyes, by the way, are ours when we go and look at that tomb. So the classical sources, Lucrece is largely silent, but the Bard argues against her rape for 75 lines. And following the rape, she goes off the classical script for 846 lines of soliloquy. And she says, "For me, I am mistress of my fate." That to me is the center of the poem. And there is where the Bard gives this female victim her own agency with a roar. And that is where I hear the echo of the tell the truth instruction that Oxford wrote in Latin inside that little New Testament he sent to Anne from Venice. And this is Anne post-mortem telling the truth in the guise of Lucrece. So, who is Lucrece's father? A father and husband in the classical source mutually mourn their loss. The Bard's father and husband engage in this tug of war as to who loved the deceased Lucrece and mourns her more. From history, we know that this took place between Burleigh and Oxford when Anne died.
they jump into the grave and fight with each other like Hamlet and Laertes? I loved her more. No, I loved her more.
Well, it's repeated here in Lucrece. The father says, "She is mine." "Oh, she is mine," replies the husband. Anyway, I see this as the monumental poem that Oxford wrote is the answer to that enormous gaudy monument in Westminster Abbey. And, Sonnet 55 says, "Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme." Okay, let's get to what we all want to know. Who's Tarquin? I want to say up front, and I will continue to say, we don't know for certain, but we have a lot of clues.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. So the first clue is the number of times that the rapist is identified by reference to his eyes. Queen Elizabeth, we know, had pet names for people in the court, and the one for Leicester was her eyes. He even signed his letters to the queen with drawing little eyes instead of his name. Throughout the poem, Tarquin's eyes are traitors, lustful, willful, burning, dead-killing, heavy, eager, and when he enters Lucrece's chamber, he rolls his greedy eyeballs in his head. That's such a fabulous line.
And I believe
Tarquin
the
is
invention of the word eyeball occurs right there.
Yes, you said that in your right. That was part of your talk. Tarquin is colored with his high estate, hiding base sins in pleats of majesty. Now, the real Tarquin was a king's son, but Leicester was a highly placed courtier, known for having access to the pleats of the queen's skirts as her lover to protect him. Whether true or malicious slander, Leicester's Commonwealth does make the bard's Tarquin look like Leicester. After proposing to Lucrece that she be his secret friend, Lucrece says, "The poison is simple, is compacted in a pure compound. Being so applied, his venom, in effect, is purified," which sounds a lot like poison, yeah? Mm-hmm. And after the rape, Lucrece alludes to Leicester's sexual relationships with the queen and her ladies-in-waiting, and she wishes she could share her pain with other women. She says, the silver shining queen he would disdain, her twinkling handmaids too, defiled by him, through night's black bosom should not peep again. So should I have had co-partners in my pain. And I think Anne couldn't share her pain with other victims. She had to keep silent to keep from damaging her father's political career.
But she knew that other victims existed. She knew this man. She knew the villain that he was.
Did. Okay, so wrapping it up. At the end of the soliloquy, Lucrece directs her anger and her nails at Helen of Troy, well-known stand-in for Elizabeth, just like New Troy is well-known to be London, as Earl Showerman shared with us on another episode. Lucrece accuses Helen of being the source of all Lucrece's personal woes. "Show me the strumpet that began to stir, that with my nails her beauty I may tear." So, of course, the queen was ever beautiful, even in 1594, and she just got called a strumpet and the source of Anne Cecil's woes. Sounds like Anne has a bite. Anne goes on to address Helen's lover, Paris, accusing him and his lust and his burning eye of incurring a load of wrath that is causing Troy to burn, in a painting that she's thinking about. But it's not difficult to substitute identities and realize Paris is Leicester, and the accusation is that Leicester is responsible for this political unrest in London of 1594. And Lucrece goes on to say, "And here in Troy, for trespass of thine eye, the sire, the son, the dame, the daughter die." So Leicester's wandering eye that trespassed her caused the figurative death of the sire, who is Oxford, the son, who is Harry, the dame, who is Anne, and the daughter, who is Bess. And that is how the bard, through Lucrece, comes closest to naming Leicester outright as Anne's rapist, and he takes his revenge, while his father-in-law remains silent. So, does anyone think it was a good idea for the poet to use his real name on these works?
Not unless he wanted to die.
No,
only if
right?
he wants to die.
No, only if he wants to die. So think about what it took Oxford not to reveal what happened to him and Anne for 20 years, and then to bring these private tragedies to light in this incredible way. He did it to reclaim the story of his own life, Harry's, Bess's, and Anne's, and to promote Harry as the heir. And he did it because he was motivated by selfless, grand, and courageous duty and service. But he also did it because if you read that dedication one more time, what I have done is yours, what I have to do is yours. Being part in all I have, devoutedly yours.
It's beautiful, Dorothea. And
Thank
no,
you,
it's absolutely
Stephen.
beautiful. And I think that you then look at some of the motivation behind it also being an explanation to these two children why they are not brother and sister, but yet brother and sister. You know what I mean? So they're technically not blood relatives in any way, but they have been raised like brother and sister in so many ways, and very similar to the way that Edward and Anne were raised in the same household together, though. But I think in some ways he's also saying to Harry, it's okay to marry her. She's not your sister. It's not incest.
Yes, it's not incest. But also, as you said, I think very touchingly to explain to them who they are and also to clear it up. It's, their story as well. And Burleigh had obfuscated it, and Oxford wanted them to know the truth. And we have these beautiful
This is
poems.
a movie that needs to be made. I've said it so many other times, but like just this part of it, you could just do this part of it. I don't know if you're familiar with a series out there that's long since gone called The Tudors, which was an awesome series about Henry VIII. Another great one that's out there right now that's historical fiction is Outlander. If you've ever watched any episodes of that,
Yes.
This would crush those. If this were turned into a series on Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu or whoever, if anyone out there knows any of those producers, send them my way. I'll write it for them. Dorothea will help me. We'll do it. We'll co-write it, Dorothea, and we'll put together one of the greatest television series in the history of ever. Because listen to this. Like you can't write this stuff. You can't make it up.
No, you can't make it up. You absolutely can't make it up. So anyway, it is quite a tale.
As I said earlier in the episode, I'm going to receive so many emails about this, and I can't wait. I want you all to write me. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. I want to hear from you. This is explosive. It's one of our longest episodes, but it needed to be because this is explosive. This could change everything. It certainly changes the way I will look at everything from this point forward. And I don't know why it hasn't been discussed like this before. And I don't know why these two original works of this writer have been neglected the way that they have been. And I think that it is the first part of the puzzle that needs to be answered before moving forward on any other topic. Why these poems? Why back to back like this? Why this name coming on the scene for the first time ever with these two poems? Why dedicated to this young Earl? And what is really happening there, and what are the meanings? And I think you've just summed it up brilliantly.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you. As I said, I hope everyone goes and grabs their copy and opens to the dedication of Venus and Adonis and starts there.
The dedication to Venus and Adonis is technically the first time whoever William Shakespeare is puts quill to paper. The first words of that dedication are the first words of this writer. Start there, ladies and gentlemen, and let's work forward from that point. And I think, Dorothy, you just shattered people's worlds. What an incredible episode. Thank you so much. Is there any last bits that you need to share with us? What is your next step now?
My next step now. I think I owe you a podcast on Elizabeth Trentham.
That is true. We do need so that's the beginning. This is the beginning. That's the end, right?
There we go.
And I believe looking into her might explain how all of this gets preserved and how we get a first folio and how we are here today. But wow, Start at the top, folks. Start at that dedication. Go out and grab your copies of Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. Be prepared. Have a box of tissue with you. Lucrece is so moving. It's just so moving. This episode has been moving to me. I'm sitting here. I'm holding back tears because this story is so real, and the tragedies that these people suffered are so real. And this man was so incredibly talented to be able to put it to paper for all of us to know and have for eternity. And wow, isn't that why we're here? That's exactly why we're here.
That's why we're here. It's Sir my Lord of Oxford.
I wear his colors proudly.
Little blue
yes.
boar?
Yes. Yes,
the Order of the Blue Boar, Stephen. We need to award you the Order of the Blue Board.
Blue
Boar
love
for running these podcasts.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, there you go, Quillers. If you want to learn more, you can do so. Go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org and research, dig, delve deep, discount us if you want, attack our theories, come after me. I love it. Or write your words of praise. I love those too. But go visit the website. Go find out more. It is your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. We've also talked about other resources here on the program. Most recently, we talked about the Shakespeare Facebook page. The DeVere Society as well is another great resource out there. Shakespeare Authorship Coalition. Also out there, doubtaboutwill.org. Go explore, ladies and gentlemen, because remember what we're all about right here on this series is keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.